The most clarifying phrase I've ever heard in terms of understanding the nature of imperialism is wealth pump. At its essence, imperialism functions as a wealth pump, a mechanism for transferring resources, labor, and economic control from one nation to another for the benefit of the imperial power. Everything else is just window dressing. In fact, the specific justifications for this transfer rotate through history. You've got civilizing inferior peoples, so we better take all their stuff. You've got protecting commerce, so we better take all their stuff. Countering communism, fighting drugs, better take all their stuff. Counterterrorism, but we're going to take your stuff while we're at it. And now we have calling drugs terrorism because they didn't even bother to be original this time. And even though some people may genuinely believe in those stated reasons, it's impossible to escape the fact that the major end goal remains constant: self-enrichment. Now, I got thinking about all this through the lens of traditional criminal investigation, because at its core, imperialism in all of its forms should basically be thought of as a crime. So I found this clarifying. After a crime, the investigators are always looking to establish means, motive, and opportunity, right? We're all familiar with that. When it comes to the crime of imperialism, the means is basically the military. It's a little more complicated than that, with all the businesses and the banks looking to profit, but underlying all of those is the threat of military force. As for motive, that's pretty simple and consistent: profit, wealth extraction, wealth pump, whatever you want to call it. That's always the foundational motivation. As I said, other ideological motivations may also be there, but there's a reason why imperial powers pretty much only try to impose their ideological motivations in areas of the world where wealth can also be extracted at the same time as we're doing whatever else: spreading democracy, saving the world from communism, civilizing the primitive heathens, etc., etc. So maybe stealing their wealth is part of the calculation, or maybe those imperialists just keep getting lucky. And then finally, there's opportunity. And when it comes to foreign policy, having the opportunity means that A, no one's going to try to stop you by force, not really, and B, the price you are likely to pay regarding economics and international relations is lower than the expected benefits. So for instance, Russia invaded Ukraine, but became an international pariah with all kinds of knock-on effects and economic costs. That's what I mean when I say that there can be a price to pay for actions on the international stage. So whether the crime is at the small individual level, shoplifting, or pretty serious but still individual murder, or scale it all the way up to international politics, colonialism, economic and cultural imperialism, it doesn't really matter. The need for means, motive, and opportunity remain the same. And with that framework in mind, I want to remind everyone of another common refrain we're all familiar with: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The point being that even good people are inevitably corrupted by having too much power or by having it for too long. And I would argue that the same essentially goes for nations, just scaled up a bit from the effects of individuals. Though, of course, they're related because nations are run by individuals. I get it. So in the framework of international policy, I would argue that means, motive, and opportunity for imperialism is just another way of describing power, particularly unchecked or insufficiently checked power. And maybe most importantly, that this kind of power is just as corrupting to a nation as when an individual holds too much power. All of which brings me to a minor but important critique I have of a lot of the anti-imperialist rhetoric I regularly hear. The problem as I see it is that it often focuses on the individual nations currently guilty of imperialism without much of a structural framework to help understand it. Now, naturally, the US deserves plenty of criticism regarding imperialistic actions it's taken over the years, but attempting to make that case without the structural framework goes badly in at least two ways. Number one, regular people don't love hearing their country criticized. And so that direct approach elicits a lot of rah-rah America backlash, as well as lots of, well, but we meant well and had good intentions sort of excuse making. So the anti-imperialist message just isn't very effective because people don't want to hear it when it comes at them that way. And two, I have heard too many people fall into the simplistic mindset of starting with a critique of imperialism focused on the US, fair enough, finding our imperialistic history to be quite long, and then concluding simplistically that there must be something inherently different or practically evil about the country. And once you've gone down that path, you start falling for other fallacies like, if the US is a great evil, then they must be wrong about everything. And then the other one, anyone opposing them must be on the right side of history. That's how you get people on the left who would otherwise condemn wars of aggression, supporting or at least whitewashing the actions of a country like Russia in Ukraine. And if that sounds like it doesn't make sense, you're right. It's just that people get themselves tied into knots when they fail to incorporate structural thinking into their analysis. They try to make everything too simple, and it's impossible to get those, square pegs in those round holes, and you flail. Now, I would argue that the US is not evil by nature or even very special. Rather, the US possesses historically unprecedented power, meaning military dominance, economic leverage, and cultural reach. And although there are many complicated reasons for this, the most prominent reason is dumb luck of geography. The US was able to concentrate a huge amount of wealth thanks to how big we are, the pull factor of the new world that brought waves and waves of immigrants here, who then helped drive the economic engine for centuries. Then, after World War II, again, thanks to geography, everyone else had to rebuild post-war, while our cities and infrastructure were still intact, giving us an even further head start. So we ended up with a huge pile of money and power, mostly out of luck, because we happened to be the people who benefited from all those structural forces and the dumb luck of geography that gave us a leg up over other countries. In other words, power. And that power, in the form of means, military, economic infrastructure, motive, wealth accumulation, which everyone has, and opportunity, the fact that no one was really able to stand up to us, has acted as a corrupting influence on American foreign policy. And the important point is that this isn't unique to Americans as a people or a country. If any other nation possessed the level of power that the United States does, the same structural incentives would push that country toward similar imperial behavior. So the question isn't whether Americans or America as a country is evil or to be perpetually condemned. The question is, what does $900 billion in military spending and the ability to project force globally without any pushback do to a nation's decision-making process? That kind of framing, I think, helps fix the two problems that I identified before. Number one, I think that it'll make people more accepting of the argument that there is a problem at all, because it's a criticism of a system rather than of a people. So it shouldn't spark the same reflexive defensiveness. And two, it should be clarifying to those wanting to critique the imperialism of the US without falling for silly, simplistic, us versus them, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thinking. Because a structural analysis can be applied anywhere without the results of the analysis on one country really affecting or coloring at all the analysis of another. Whether it be the US in Iraq and Afghanistan, or now Venezuela, it could be Israel and Palestine with US support, it could be Russia and Ukraine. Imperialism anywhere is a threat to peace and freedom everywhere. And we should be clear-eyed about that in every given situation, regardless of who's involved. Okay, so where does this leave us as critics of imperialism generally and US imperialism in particular? Rather than trying to eliminate the motive of wealth extraction, which is impossible, or simply appealing to American virtue, which is definitely going to be insufficient, we need to focus on reducing means and opportunity. So regarding means, we need to constrain military spending and the ability to project power. And this should be done ideally in the context of international arms reduction treaties so that no one runs into the problem of unilateral disarmament, giving bad actors greater opportunity to do harm. That's a real thing. And as for opportunity, the world needs to strengthen international law and enforcement mechanisms that would make imperialism costlier to those who would consider it. And additionally, we as Americans need to understand that defending our position as a hegemonic power in the world is ultimately self-defeating in the big picture, because all of the benefits of us being in this position are only felt by the already wealthy and powerful, while the negatives end up being felt by everyone. We shouldn't be opposed to a redistribution of global power so that no single nation has such stark advantages as the US has had in recent decades. And in the US, we're all taught to be proud of our governmental system of checks and balances that is supposed to constrain power and prevent that power from corrupting our leaders. That's the whole point. Now, scale that up to the international level and see why it's so dangerous for one country, any country, to have too much power for too long. It doesn't matter how good their intentions are, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the best anti-imperialism doesn't have that much to do with just opposing imperialists. Just like how promoting democracy isn't mostly about opposing tyrants. It's about focusing on the structures, working toward a world of diffused power and wealth rather than the inherently dangerous and corrupt nature of concentrated power and concentrated wealth in all its forms.